Hello, hello, hello. All right. So, today we're finishing up popular culture. All right. We are going into the beginnings of American Lit on through the end of the 1800s. And since recording this and you see how hard picture pictures are, I'm the discussion question for the day is going to be about American art. All right. So, under discussions and Canvas, you can check that out. All right. So, um, that will be, discussion for the day. Do that for roll. And we'll do a lecture on American Lit. I've always loved books. Will always love books. Um, so what we're doing is we are getting into where we actually have a true American literature. All right. Your key points for the day are the Transcendentalists, Harriet Beecher Stowe, Mark Twain, and then at the end of all things, the importance. All right. The importance of popular culture. All right. So, with this, let's get going. All right. Let's talk about American Lit. This is by far the most popular and the most important focus in American leisure culture or popular culture of the 1800s. This is where the large majority of the people went. With education being promoted so much and loved so much, one of the big things with this is this idea. It's not the best way to look at it is like once you buy a book, you have it forever. You constantly have this wonderful trip into another world. Books are wonderful. You have them always, and every time you read them, you get something new. It's just like music in many ways. So, with this, with the birth of American Lit, what we're going to focus on is James Fenimore Cooper. All right. Cooper was just everything to Americans in basically the first half of the 1800s. What he wrote was considered to be historical romances. In this, the topics is that he would pull from the 16, 17, and 1800s stories about men on the frontier, whether they were, you know, white frontiersmen or Native American life. So you have this big push for frontier and Native American life, talking about what was America during these 3 centuries. This whole push, this whole way of life of the frontier, of the American man, whether they were white, African American, or Native American, or any other, going into the wilderness. All right. These historical romances focused around one character, typically, Natty Bumppo. He had a series of books called the Leather Stocking Tales, and those stories, those novels, like I said, would be about Natty Bumppo, this white American explorer, this white frontiersman, and his adventures into the wilderness. His most famous book that lives with us to this very day, of course, is The Last of the Mohicans. It has been in numerous movies, and it's become a major part of American popular culture in the written word and on screen. The latest version the latest version I know of is the Daniel Day-Lewis version in the 1990s. All right. So we have Cooper. And many people consider Cooper to be the true creator and push of this genre of American lit. But next, what we're going to get into are the Transcendentalists. This is your first key point of the day, and it's a very important key point of the day. This is America's first philosophy, and this, in many ways, is a great description of what many in the 1800s would come to believe is America. All right. It's hard, very hard, to define Transcendentalism. The best person to go to is Ralph Waldo Emerson. All of his friends knew him by Waldo. This man was a lecturer, a philosopher, an essayist, and poet. He led this Transcendentalist movement, and the whole idea around Transcendentalism is this, like I said, the first American philosophy, which was based on the idea of individualism, the moral worth of an individual, and the ability of that individual to exercise one's ideals, values, and to push and create a better world. This is focused on how, for these kind of things to happen, you need a person that is independent in thought, independent in action. You can't have a person that is of the group mentality. Group mentality creates status quo. It creates a world that doesn't promote democracy. You need this push, this value of independence, this individualism to go for the core idea, according to Emerson, of democracy: self-reliance. All right? For a person to be truly democratic, for a person to be truly free, you have to be self-reliant. You have to be able to take care of yourself. This is a huge push, all right? Emerson, like I said, was just put out huge numbers of essays and lectures. He was a famous lecturer. And his most important work that still resides with us to this day is Nature. This, I think, is one of the most important books to understand what it means to be an American. All right? So if you can, get a hold of it, read Nature. All right. And Emerson gives us in different ways definitions. Kind of roundabout definitions of Transcendentalism. So I'll give you those right now. All right. So Transcendentalism really focuses on the claims that there is an ideal reality transcending ordinary life that can be known only by individual intuition. All right, sorry, hiccup. All right, transcendentalism. Let me read his quote. Claims that there is an ideal reality transcending ordinary life that can be known only by individual institution. This ideology promotes individualism and self-reliance. All right. Here's another one from Emerson that, in a beautiful way, gives you a definition of transcendentalism. All right. We will walk on our own feet. We will work with our own hands. We will speak our own minds. A nation of men will, for the first time, exist because each believes himself inspired by the divine soul, which also inspires all men. All right. Like I said, this is not an easy definition of things. Transcendentalism is hard to define, but in it, you have two of the most important ideas of Americanism: individualism and self-reliance. Emerson. All right. So, not only do we have Emerson, but we have people like Henry David Thoreau. Thoreau was another transcendentalist, essayist, poet, philosopher, much like Emerson. But he was also a naturalist. He believed that the Americans' place was in nature, being a part of nature. And one of his most famous works that you can check out is Walden. All right. Also, though, Thoreau would also publish another very important pamphlet work called On Civil Disobedience. This, of course, focused on protest. He would do this as with the war, the Mexican-American War in the late 1840s. He would refuse to support it. He would be a protester against it. He believed that blood for land was evil. And when he tried to vote, and they required a poll tax, and it would be one of the things that would help support the war, he refused to pay the poll tax, but voted anyway. And in his protest against this war, he would be arrested. So you have his push of the idea of American protest in the mid-1800s with this on civil disobedience. Hopefully, between last week, this, and other things we'll talk about this semester, and what is going on in the world around you, you'll see how important it is for Americans to participate and to make a better world. You only can make a better world by participating. All right. Other than Emerson and Thoreau and the Transcendentalist, you also have Herman Melville and Nathaniel Hawthorne. All right. Melville was a novelist, short story writer, and a poet. His most famous work, and is considered even to this day to be one of the most important and magnificent works in American literature, Moby Dick. All right. But we also have Hawthorne. Hawthorne would basically go against transcendentalism. He would be a major push of the Romantics. The idea of this feeling literature, not really a philosophy or a way to create better people. This is a very emotional response to, well, a very emotional response to the world around. All right. Um, like I said, he is a novelist. I mean, he wrote The Scarlet Letter, The House of the Seven Gables, many others. But those are the two that I had to read both of those in high school. I'm not sure if you guys did, but these are still to this very day taught in the American education system. If you didn't read them then, you will probably read them here in college. But Hawthorne is known for this dark romanticism. And what that means is this is about really kind of talking and thinking and really ruminating on this fascination that Americans have with our dark side, with the dark. Things like, the irrational emotions of anger, all these other things, and demonic possession, demonic influence in the world, and the grotesque horrors that we impose on one another. So we have Hawthorne, we have Melville, we have Thoreau, we have Emerson, we have some of the major writers. Like I said, with Thoreau, Melville, Emerson, we have our transcendentalist. Hawthorne is the one that starts pushing us away from this. And we also have some heavy, heavy hitting poets. All right. All these others also had poet added on, but they're not as well. People like Walt Whitman and Emily Dickinson would come to define poetry in completely new ways. All right. And let's start with my favorite poet of all time, Walt Whitman. He was a poet, essayist, journalist. His most famous work, of course, is Leaves of Grass. This is a compendium of his, or in a word you guys probably understand with popular culture, omnibus of his works. And Leaves of Grass is just wonderfully celebratory of what people can be, what they can overcome, what they can live through, and how they can love. It's a beautiful work. It doesn't shy away from the negative or the horrific, but he is just an amazing writer. This is not any of his, well, most of his poetic works aren't in a traditional framework. He is considered to be the father of free verse. And this is the idea that a poet can tap into the rhythm of natural speak and still create this fluid, poetical, beautiful story. So we have Whitman. All right. The last poet that I want to bring up is Emily Dickinson. Dickinson was just a poet. All right. She lived her entire life in depression in many ways, what we would consider it. She was very shy, stayed out of the limelight, stayed very, very rarely published anything during her lifetime. It wouldn't be until her death that there would be like a compendium, an omnibus, whatever you want to call it, a work that would put out her poetry. This would be one of her close friends that would do it for her. And nowadays, she is considered one of the, she is at the top of the list of American poets. Her focus is death, immortality for the most part. And with this, it really resonates with youth. If I know poetry is kind of dying, but as long as there's teenagers, Emily Dickinson should survive. She really does a great job of focusing on the angst of life. So, we have some of our major authors, some of our major writers, however you want to pull them together. We have our first American philosophy with transcendentalism, and American fiction kicked off with Cooper, right? So let's kind of dive into our next little section. And I always like to put this as women in American fiction. Female writers played a huge role in shaping American literature. And there's certain ones that we need to cover. The first one I want to talk about is Louisa May Alcott. All right. She's a novelist, a poet, and short story writer. All right. The most famous thing she is known for is Little Women. If you haven't read it, this is one of the works in American fiction that you just have to read. This is such an important and seminal work in American literature. Numerous movies. This has been a part of American culture even into this century. In this century, we have a new movie about it. This is a wonderful work. She also creates a new genre of American fiction, what we would consider youth fiction. Books written for the young and adolescent. All right. So we have Alcott, right? Not only do we have Alcott, we have our next key point, right? Our next key point is Harriet Beecher Stowe, all right? Harriet Beecher Stowe comes from a long line of preachers and abolitionists. And she would spend her entire life in the abolitionist movement fighting against slavery. She was also an author. She wrote novels. Her most famous novel, of course, is Uncle Tom's Cabin. All right. This, in the 1800s, was the most controversial, the most controversial novel. This, of course, is where she compiled all of the stories that she had ever heard about slavery. This is a fictional account of slavery, but it is based on her lifetime in abolitionism and all the stories that she had heard from former slaves and runaway slaves, and stories from other abolitionists that had helped free slaves. So what she creates in this fictional work is the pinnacle story on the most grotesque, everything that is horrible about slavery. All right. So, with Uncle Tom's Cabin, this becomes a huge influential work in America during the 1850s. It's banned throughout the South. But this book, as America reads it, as it spreads through the Northeast, the Midwest, and the far West, it pulls people into the anti-slavery movement that had never been involved before. Once Americans are exposed to the true horrors of slavery, they start coming in, contributing money, time, and effort to end this institution of slavery. To kind of give you an idea, she was a very important figure in the late 1800s. And one of the best stories is that Abraham Lincoln invited her to the White House for dinner, or down here with us, supper. All right, so she shows up to the White House and is walking across the lawn to meet Lincoln and have supper with him that day. And Lincoln sees her coming. He goes out, goes onto the lawn of the White House. She was a tiny, tiny little woman. And as we know, Lincoln is a big guy. He is very tall. And Lincoln goes out onto the White House lawn, picks her up, gives her a big hug, and says, "So you're the little lady that started this war." Resonates, right? It is, this book plays such a big role in turning huge numbers of Americans against the institution of slavery. So we've got Stepp, we've got Alcott. Completely different ways, completely different kind of novels, but two people, two female writers that completely changed American writing and influenced American culture to this day. There were also what were known as the lady novelist of the time. The most famous lady novelist was Catherine Maria Sedgwick. Sedgwick put out books such as Clarence, The Lamplighter, other things. These are kind of like in the line of modern romance novels, modern Harlequin romance novels. These are meant for middle-class women at home to fantasize about these hunky men and the love that they can bring them. These become big. This becomes a millions and millions of dollars a year industry. So you also have people like Catherine Maria Sedgwick that make huge fortunes writing pulp fiction, crap fiction about sexual exploits, right? Kind of like Danielle Steele and the Harlequin romance novels of the 20th century. We also have what many people consider to be regional writers, all right? Regional writers in this time tended to be either Northerners or Southerners that tended to focus on subjects that related to those two groups, all right? Today we're going to talk about Mark Twain, Edgar Allan Poe, and Stephen Crane. All right. Our first two, Mark Twain and Edgar Allan Poe, were Southerners and really focused in on what would now be considered the beginnings of Southern literature. All right. Twain wrote such beautiful works as, well, such amazing works and resonant works as The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, Tom Sawyer, Innocents Abroad. There's just so many works by Twain that captures the spirit of what it means to be American and Southern. Twain himself is a highly controversial figure. Huckleberry Finn, of course, is banned in a lot of schools today and libraries today, though it shouldn't be. mainly because it uses a very derogatory word about African Americans, and it's because Twain is the first to actually write in this idea of speech. All of these other writers that we've talked about really focused on and really got into and were really highly educated, very formal writing, very structured writing. Um, Twain's fiction flowed with current events, flowed through how life was for the average person. And he used the dialect of the average person. And since he was in the South and wrote about the South, there are derogatory words that were used to capture the essence. Um, Twain himself, you can see in Huckleberry Finn, was against slavery because Finn, as he was fleeing south, trying to escape where he came from, he escaped with an African American slave called Jim. He and Jim were floating down the Mississippi trying to escape, and in one of the chapters, chapter 10, um, Huckleberry Finn starts writing a letter, and he's going to take it into town and give Jim up. And in this letter, and in his thoughts as he's writing this letter, it's an amazing look into an American of the time that comes to realize the evils of slavery. He talks about how religion, how society, how life, and his parents and everybody around him talked about the importance of slavery in society and how it was normal. But once that he got to know this man, this is where the conflict comes in. Once he got to know Jim, he saw him as no different than himself. He saw him as another person, not a beast of burden, not a slave. So after he writes this letter to turn him in, he's sitting there in front of the campfire as Jim sleeps. And he's thinking to himself, should I turn him in? This is what I've been taught since I was a baby. This is what I'm supposed to do according to the status quo in society. But as he's sitting there looking at Jim, thinking about all this and thinking about all they've been through, he rips up the letter and throws it in the fire. Once he throws it in the fire, he says, damn it all to hell and damn me to hell. He's accepted that if society wants this, he doesn't believe it's right. And if he's going to hell according to his preachers, he'll go to hell. He's going to stand up for his friend. And they keep going. So we've got, it's a highly controversial book because of the use of derogatory words, but it's a very important book in that it's a book that deals with race and humanity. And it's something that we still need to think about, and it's definitely something we still need to think about and discuss and have compassion about. This is something that's still not solved. Just look around you right now at the horrors that African Americans have to face. This idea of race needs to be addressed. And if you look at it from an anthropological point of view, there's only one race, the human race. Doesn't matter what shades we are. But scientifically, there's just the human race. Society is what imposes these ideas of racism that need to be gotten rid of. So we have Twain. He is a huge, important writer between his short stories, his novels, and his conveyance of the importance of the person, no matter what color they are, who they are, and this push away from the status quo. Twain is a rebellious writer. We also have Edgar Allan Poe. Of course, you probably have heard of Edgar Allan Poe. He is, in many ways, the birth of horror fiction in American literature. He was a poet and writer. Um, you know, The Raven, The Telltale Heart, The Murders at Rue Morgue, and many, many others give the birth of the horror story or horror fiction in American history. But not only does he give us the birth of horror, he also creates the detective story. With The Telltale Heart, The Murders of Rue Morgue, and many of his other works, you get this, this detective, this policeman, this person going in and trying to solve these crimes. And with Poe, he becomes a huge influence, like I said, in two different genres of American literature. And Poe would influence the creation of Sherlock Holmes. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, a British writer, would create the character Sherlock Holmes and many others in his novels. And he was inspired to do this by the detective stories of of Edgar Allan Poe. Poe made his money as a journalist. He was always in horrific conditions. He was an alcoholic and a drug addict. Um, he would die young. They would find him frozen to death in his underwear in a park. So we've got Poe, a rock star of the literary world. And the last one in this northern and southern regional writers that I want to cover is Stephen Crane. All right. Crane is considered to be a poet, novelist, short story writer, and he is the major individual that would give us what we refer to now as realism and American naturalism. So whether you want to call him a realist or a naturalist, it's interchangeable. The whole idea of it is that he was writing novels. He was writing novels about real things, real happenings, real life. What was going on? He was giving vivid descriptions of the landscape and of the people. And he was telling stories, not fictional stories, not idealistic or horrific, but stories that resonated with people because of the realism of it, the reality. Two of his most important works, The Red Badge of Courage is one of the most famous novels about the Civil War. And also Maggie, Girl of the Streets, which is about this poor girl that's a prostitute and how her life goes. Both of them are gritty, dark, and depressing. But they describe the hardships of real life. So we have American lit in the 1800s and how it would really kind of create so many different views of America in so many different ways. And remember, this was the most popular form. The written word was the most important thing and what most people went to for entertainment. This is what people read to each other in their homes and read over and over again. So books were the most important part of popular culture in the 1800s. And the last thing I'm going to talk about with American literature is the narrative. In the 1800s, it was referred to as the narrative. Nowadays, we would call them biographies, travel journals, or autobiographies. But back then, they referred to them as the narrative. And narratives were the most popular form of reading in America. Americans loved to read about Americans that were doing different things than they were. All right. We talked about, like Sojourner Truth, Frederick Douglass, all these people, they had autobiographies published that people just lapped up and loved. Um, Lewis and Clark put out their journals, and there was also other travel journals that would be compiled. And one of the ones, The History of the Expedition under the command of Captains Lewis and Clark to the Sources of the Missouri, was a very popular travel journal. And, you have the narrative of Davy Crockett. Many of these other frontiersmen and explorers would write stories, autobiographies, or other people would write about them, telling about exploration, the travel journal. This was the most popular form of literature in America during the time. Like I also said, there was the autobiography with people like Frederick Douglass, with Sojourner Truth, with all of these major figures. They would come out. So we have travel journals, we have autobiographies, and finally we have the biography, where another person writes about an individual. The narrative of the life of Davy Crockett is a big one during that time. Remember where we talked about Parson Weems and his biography of George Washington? That was the highest of the high. That was the biography that most people had. So this narrative, the idea of chronicling one's life by the individual themselves or by research from another, was highly popular form of writing in the 1800s. So, with that is the last part of fiction, the last part of American Lit. For this class, for this last part, this 19.3 lecture on popular culture, the discussion that I'm going to put on canvas for you guys and gals is about art. Art is not, it's the intricacies of it, I can't really give you and when I hold up an iPad for you to see. So what I want you to do is, for your discussion question, pick an artist, look at their work, and pick one of their pieces of art. It can be John James Audubon. It could be John Trumbull. It could be Emmanuel Gottlieb Lutz. It could be George Caleb Bingham, Thomas Moran, or Thomas Waterman Wood. I want you to pick one of their famous works, really kind of look at it, and give me a description, a long paragraph description of this. All right. So, the last thing, your last key point, is the importance of popular culture, and that's where we'll wrap all of this up. So, something to think about. Popular culture, it can be the creator or the reflector of mainstream thoughts, beliefs, and reality. Or it can be, popular culture can be where continues on, it can be not just a reflection of it, but a deep dive into the beliefs and thoughts and realities of a culture, of a society. And not only could it be, where the popular culture creates this new way of life or reflects a way of life, it can give the viewer a glimpse into what a people wants to be or what they don't want to be. All right. So this can be important as well. But popular culture, in many ways, at the basic level, is just a reflection of how people view themselves and the world in which they live. So, the importance of popular culture: it can shape society, and it can also do a good job of illustrating what society is. All right. Um, for the most part, a lot of TV, movies, and everything else depict in different visions how they see the world. So you have that. On that other side, where it shapes things, like I said, where it becomes a creator. The perfect example is is the show Friends. Um, this is a show that came out in the 1990s, 1993 to be exact, and would run into the 2000s. Friends is about these group of friends in New York City. I'm sure most of you have heard of this show. If you haven't, look it up. This was one of the most popular shows of the 90s and the aughts. This was like what everybody was watching. And with this, one of the main things they did was they hung out in this coffee place called Central Perk. Before the show Friends, the only place you saw to get coffee were at places like Hardee's, McDonald's, Denny's, restaurants that served coffee. But once Friends came out and popularized the coffee shop, it became huge. Starbucks just went crazy. Caribou Jim's, Cup of Joe, all of these different franchises of coffee shops popped up everywhere. They're still with us today. Hell, in the South, between coffee shops, churches, and banks, you can't go anywhere without seeing them. So you'll see, how popular culture, how a TV show can shape the world around us. Like I said, before this show came out, there was no such thing in mainstream American society throughout America as a coffee shop. You had to go to a place that served food, whether it was like a place that did bagels and different entrees and different things like that. You could get a cup of coffee, but you went to a place that served food and you got your coffee there. Not a place that was based around coffee. So, different ways and different things that you can see the importance of popular culture. All right. Well, this ends our look into the birth of popular culture in the 1800s. And with that, good luck. Stay safe. Stay healthy. Let's see. There we go.